I really do not want to make this video. Cliché, I know. But if there ever was a video to invoke said cliché, the one in which I admit I was gaslighted into changing my views on a book such as Lolita is certainly up there. It's hard enough to admit you are wrong under the best of circumstances, but on a topic such as this as a CSA survivor, it makes me feel tainted. But that's the thing. The narrative that Lolita is a subversive critique, a warning about child predators and the dangers of their unreliable narratives, has become so prolific that it needs to be countered without quarter. Because I get the feeling that there's a lot of people like me who are only going off of a partial picture, a picture that was painted to make Vladimir Nabokov seem like a champion for victims of child abuse, when that's simply not true. And it looks like I've drawn the short straw. Again. But first, a quick content warning for the following: child abuse, sexual abuse, glorification of child sexual abuse, and gaslighting. If our work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so I can keep the channel running. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. I would usually give a legal disclaimer here, but thankfully, most of the people I'll be talking about today are dead, so fuck them. And yes, that does include the hitch. Oh, don't you worry, we'll be getting to him in a bit. Hi there, mine's Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and we need to talk about the facts that, contrary to what so many people will leap at the opportunity to tell you, Lolita isn't a subversive critique of child predators, but a book which uses child sexual abuse as window dressing. To, in Nabokov's own words, invoke a sense of curiosity, tenderness, kindness, and even ecstasy. And yes, this is in relation to a story in which a 38-year-old man kidnaps and rapes a 12-year-old girl. Of course, I've been bringing Lolita up in my work after it re-emerged that self-presented protector of women and children, Joanne Kathleen Rowling, had praised Lolita as a, quote, great and tragic love story, end quote. And this is what I had to say on that. Now, to begin with, I assume this to be satire. Suze is a comedian, everybody knows that Lolita is a child abuse story written from the perspective of an unreliable narrator. Surely there's no way someone, not even J.K. Rowling, as incredulous as she may be, would say something so monumentally grotesque. At least I did think that until I found an archive copy of the quote. You see, it had been given as part of a 2000 interview on Radio 4, and the section in question was later picked up and reported on in the Sunday Herald. And it is that Sunday Herald article which has subsequently been preserved on ASIO Quote, a website created by Harry Potter fans to keep track of Rowling's exploits and appearances. That's right. The quote is genuine, archived by Rowling's own fans. J.K. Rowling read a story about a grown man kidnapping and raping a 12-year-old girl before going on Radio 4 to describe it as a, quote, great and tragic love story, end quote. Rowling can scarcely help herself gushing about the writing and just how much it moves her, clearly not realizing that most people, when they read that story, read it as a horror story in which a sexual predator attempts to win the audience over in justifying the unjustifiable. All nuance seems lost on Rowling, who doesn't see child abuse, but a, quote, great and tragic love story, end quote. There is no love to child rape, and it's shocking that I have to say that, or at least it would be, were I not knowledgeable about the gender-critical movement, specifically its perception and treatment of trans men as naive girls, and perhaps more importantly to the subject, a sexual resource. Notice the repeated mention of how most people view the story, with me taking specific issue with Rowling's presentation of Lolita as a love story rather than her praise of the book in general. This is something I've had presented to me for years, as I'd previously condemned the book for glorifying child rape based on my own perspective of the parts I'd read. Said condemnation led a number of people to reach out and assert that, no, that's not what Nabokov was doing. Not only did Nabokov hate people who read his story as romanticization, with the author readying to burn the manuscript before a family member stopped him, but was himself a victim of child rape who wrote Lolita as a subversive critique of the very horrors he was made to suffer. Hell, we even see this general narrative present in the post calling Rowling out for her comments. That's how common this notion is. And there is evidence for some of the claims being made. In an article about another one of Nabokov's books, the original of Laura, which Nabokov supposedly wanted to destroy, it asserts that the same was true with regards to Lolita, stating that, quote, at one point, Nabokov wanted to destroy Lolita. He was on his way to the incinerator, but Vera, his wife, stopped him, end quote. As for Nabokov being a victim, I also found articles discussing that, such as one which read, quote, Nabokov had no fewer than 2 gay uncles. Konstantin Nabokov, his father's brother, was charged d'affaires at the Russian embassy in London. Vasily Rukavishnikov, Vladimir's maternal uncle, was also a diplomat, though a less successful one. He did succeed, however, in making an indelible impression on his young nephew. Uncle Ruka, as he was universally known, was a wealthy, eccentric dilettante, and there's every indication that he was in love with the young Nabokov. Certainly his attachment to his favourite nephew went beyond what was appropriate. He appears to have subjected Nabokov to a mild form of sexual abuse. When I was 8 or 9, Nabokov writes in Speak Memory, he would invariably take me upon his knee after lunch, and, while 2 young footmen were clearing the table in the empty dining room, fondle me with crooning sounds and fancy endearments. In his biography of Nabokov, Boyd notes Humbert's first feignedly nonchalant fumbles with Lolita, and suggests that the adult Nabokov's disapproval of homosexuals and his solicitude for childhood innocence may all have their origins here. End quote. Considering that both of the main assertions people made with regards to Nabokov turned out to be true, and just how many people were making these arguments, I came to the conclusion that I was wrong. That these people simply knew better than me. So I updated the way I spoke about the book, which began to come up more and more with the revelation about Rowling. Enter a close and personal friend who runs the fetish Discord server I've been hanging out in during my downtime, codenamed Communist Bat. Communist Bat shares my opinion that all art is political, and since porn is art, porn is political. As such, there is a dedicated channel in her server for politics in which Rowling came up, and that inevitably led to discussion on Rowling presenting herself as the defender of children, whilst romanticizing child rape. That's when Communist Bat asked about the names of the characters I and others were mentioning, so I responded, adding a remark about Nabokov's supposed intent, as I'd been led to believe. Communist Bat immediately pushed back on said claim because one of Nabokov's friends, a Nazi collaborator by the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, adored Lolita and forwarded Nabokov for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Nabokov was so touched by the gesture that he wrote to Solzhenitsyn thanking him, which kinda draws into question the whole Nabokov hated how people were misreading his story narrative, at least enough to warrant another look. And, oh boy, I'm glad I did. Turns out that Vladimir Nabokov hates didactic fiction. That is to say, fiction intended to teach the readers something about the world, often a moral lesson. Fables, parables, those sorts of things. You know, the very thing people claim Lolita is? And yet, in his own words, quote, "It is childish to study a work of fiction in order to gain information about a country or about a social class or about the author." And yet, one of my very few intimate friends, after reading Lolita, was sincerely worried that I should be living among such depressing people, when the only discomfort I really experienced was to live in my workshop among discarded limbs and unfinished torsos. End quote. And Nabokov repeated this sentiment, ranting that, quote, "There are gentle souls who pronounce Lolita meaningless because it does not teach them anything. I am neither a reader nor a writer of didactic fiction, and, despite John Ray's assertion, Lolita has no moral in tow. For me, a work of fiction exists only insofar as it affords me what I shall bluntly call aesthetic bliss. That is a sense of being somehow, somewhere, connected with other states of being where art, curiosity, tenderness, kindness, ecstasy is the norm. There are not many such books. All the rest is either topical trash or what some call the literature of ideas, which very often is topical trash, coming in huge blocks of plaster that are carefully transmitted from age to age until somebody comes along with a hammer and takes a good crack at Balzac, at Gorky, at Mann." End quote. Emphasis added by me. So, there goes the argument that Lolita was some sort of subversive critique of child predators. It exists purely to invoke a sense of aesthetic bliss, of ecstasy. To be, as Rowling put it, a great and tragic love story. So, in a horrific twist of irony, it turns out Rowling wasn't ignorant of Nabokov's intent, but rather everyone who told me to ignore my instinct as a CSA survivor. Though I want to be clear, I'm not angry at anyone in particular for repeating this claim to me, as angry as I am at society for allowing it to reach this point. Researching for this video showed me just how prolific the narrative is, and I was pressured into changing my perspective, so it's not like I have any sort of moral high ground to stand on. What I do have, however, is a duty to set the record straight, now that I know better, and the same goes for you. As for how this narrative took hold, besides the fact that, contrary to what many people pretend, society really doesn't take child sexual abuse seriously, this narrative has also been helped along by a number of rather famous individuals. The one who stood out to me the most due to the channel's history was Christopher Hitchens. I actually saw a couple of people assert that Hitchens was the source behind the claim that Nabokov himself was abused and thus wrote the book as a warning, but they didn't link a source on that and I couldn't find anything to that nature. What I did find was Hitchens' piece, Hurricane Lolita, which opened with the line that, quote, 50 years ago, Vladimir Nabokov published his most notorious novel. Its ravishing effects can still be felt. End quote. I feel like I need to bathe in acid after reading that. But hey, Hitchens was often a provocative prick in order to grab people's attention before going on to lay out a well-reasoned argument. So I read on, only to spot the all too familiar claim that Humbert was quote-unquote unreliable in his narrative, comparing the majority of the book to the foreword written by the fictional Dr. John Ray Jr. as evidence of this. You know, the very same John Ray that Nabokov told people to ignore if they thought his presence pointed to any moral, let alone a moral condemnation of child predation. That John Ray. Yet it's largely on this faulty premise that Hitchens then goes on to declare that, quote, it is impossible to think of employing the book, Lolita, for immoral or unsavory purposes. End quote. However, the premise is not unique to him, even within the essay, but largely an extension of Azar Nafisi's Reading Lolita in Tehran, which explores the relationship between Nafisi's students and the book after the Iranian Revolution. As Hitchens describes it, says students, quote, identify with Lolita because they can see that she wants above all to be a normal girl child. They see straight through Humbert because he is always blaming his victim and claiming that it was she who seduced him. End quote. Once more, framing Nabokov's book in a way that implies Lolita to be a condemnation based on the unreliable narrative of Humbert versus the reliable account of John Ray. Hitchens even quotes Nafisi herself, with her stating that, quote, this was the story of a 12-year-old girl who had nowhere to go. Humbert had tried to turn her into his fantasy, into his dead love, and he had destroyed her. The desperate truth of Lolita's story is not the rape of a 12-year-old by a dirty old man, but the confiscation of one's individual life by another. We don't know what Lolita would have become if Humbert had not engulfed her. Yet the novel, the finished work, is hopeful, beautiful even, a defense not just of beauty but of life. Warming up and suddenly inspired, I added that, in fact, Nabokov had taken revenge on our own Solophyzers, he had taken revenge on the Ayatollah Khomeini. End quote. Declaring it not merely a moral condemnation of child predators, but some revolutionary condemnation of oppressive states, helping the women of Iran take their revenge. Only, we know exactly how Nabokov felt about didactic fiction, about people trying to find deeper social meaning behind his work, just how much he likely would have despised Hitchens, Nafisi, and her students. I don't know the exact combination of factors that resulted in this narrative becoming so dominant. I simply highlight these two examples on account of Hitchens' notoriety, and the fact that Nafisi's book remained a New York Times bestseller for 117 weeks, so more than 2 years. For whatever reason, stories like these, one of a noble author writing a piece designed to condemn child predation, became the conventional wisdom relating to Lolita, in spite of it contradicting Nabokov's own explicitly declared views. Either way, the atheist community is not going to like me for this one. Just wait till I get around to doing my video on how James Randi was a board member of a pseudoscientific group, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which was set up by a child predator and his wife to preemptively discredit the testimonies of both their daughters, in spite of neither daughter having taken any action other than distancing themselves and their children from their father. A board Randi shared with none other than Paul McHugh, a devout Catholic and the man the Catholic Church called in to try and discredit the Catholic child abuse epidemic in 2002. Hey, someone has to claim the title of Hero Slayer, might as well be me. But returning to Nabokov, it gets even worse. Something you might have noticed so far is my focus on Nabokov the author instead of Lolita the book. And there's largely two main reasons for that. First, reading that shit as a survivor of child rape is difficult for me, personally, intent to side. I have, through my line of work, been exposed to passages in the past and find them deeply triggering for what are hopefully obvious reasons. I also burnt myself out a couple years back researching Lily Orchard's fanfic as part of our expose series on how she desensitizes her community, children included, to child sexual abuse in order to lower their defenses and make them more vulnerable. I have done my time on this topic, and let me tell you, it takes a toll. Second, people could always argue from interpretation, even if they have to declare the issue to be the product of the author's failure to convey his core message. That, hey, maybe Nabokov wasn't glorifying things, maybe he's just a shitty writer. It's much simpler to point to the author telling us that there wasn't any sort of message in Lolita, at least not intended, and certainly not the one people like to claim, and that he thought that people who think there is such a moral message are hacks. That noted, there are ways to offset the second complication, at least partially, namely taking a broader approach in assessing the rest of Nabokov's work, since once could be a major fuck-up, but by the second or third time, things begin to look a lot more suspicious. Which, oh great, that means I get to read dozens of books by someone potentially sexualizing children, bringing us back to the first complication. Yay me! Or at least I would, had someone not already done so. Enter, hiding in plain sight, an incredibly well-produced video on Lolita and Nabokov's other works, put together by Our Criticism, sent to me by Levi. He sent this to me as I was shifting from the research and note stage to the fleshing out stage, so if this part feels tagged on at all, that's because it kinda is. Fact is, a part of me questioned as to whether I should even make my video, especially after watching Al's opening in which he talks about how he didn't want to make this video and describing his journey through 3 stages that mirrored my own: visceral reaction, misguided admiration, and then rooted concern. Yet, to my surprise, he never covered Nabokov's outright condemnation of those who believed his work did, or even should, contain a moral message, or any of the people who helped sell the narrative that Lolita is a subversive critique of predators. That said, there's a lot he does cover, both about Nabokov and his work. One are the claims made about the covers for Lolita, as seen here.
Let me briefly talk about Lolita's book covers. You'll see it said all over the place that Nabokov was screwed over when it came to covers for Lolita. He never wanted depictions of girls on the cover. He wrote to his first American publisher, quote, "I want pure colours, melting clouds, accurately drawn details, a sunburst over a receding road with the light reflected in furrows and ruts after rain, and no girls." People have taken this to mean that Nabokov didn't want to encourage the sexualization of the girl in the book. Putting a pretty girl on the cover would go against the whole point of the book, he's saying. Nabokov would be disgusted to his core if he saw what kind of covers they were putting on his novel.
I have here some, not all, some of the editions of Lolita. One of my favorite ones is, that's a very pretty edition, I find. You have here, you say, that's a French edition, and you have here, other side, delightful French edition. This is beautiful, that's a Dutch edition. Isn't it nice? Beautifully done. Absolutely charming Dutch.
Al then explains that Nabokov's initial resistance was likely to do with the association between art depicting people on covers and pulp or lowbrow fiction, and Nabokov's desire to set himself apart as highbrow fiction, hence the change once he'd established Lolita as a literary success, and social perceptions had shifted. Another piece of evidence comes in Nabokov's creation and usage of the term nymphette.
So, I've mentioned the word nymphette, how Humbert used it to classify young girls he thought were sexually malicious demons in disguise. It perfectly encapsulates Humbert's self-justification, the warped distinctions of a crazy man. People in the 70-odd years since might have and reinterpreted the word, but Nabokov always meant for it to be used in the mouth of Humbert. Here's a line Nabokov wrote about the first time he saw photographs of Sue Lyon, the girl who would go on to play Lolita in Kubrick's film adaptation. "My final meeting with Kubrick must have taken place on September 25th, 1960, at his house in Beverly Hills. He showed me that day photographs of Sue Lyon, a demure nymphette of 14 or so."
Nymphette is the word Humbert uses throughout his story to blame Lolita, his victim, framing her, a 12-year-old girl, as the sexual aggressor. It is the embodiment of the very thing people like Nafisi and Hitchens claim that we, the audience, are supposed to see through in order to realize just how much of a monster Humbert is. Yet here is Nabokov using that exact same term unironically to describe a child actor, a 14-year-old girl. Thing is, Lolita isn't the only book to make use of this term or the general concept. As Al demonstrated in his video, Nabokov wrote at least 11 books sexualizing girls, many of them the exact same age as Lolita, including stories in which the child predator is the unambiguous hero of the story, completely disabling any argument about Humbert's unreliable narrative being evidence of a condemnation. So I highly suggest Al's video in which he goes through them, one by one, if you'd like to know more about just how rampant Nabokov's lust for young girls was. It is horrifying, to say the least. More so on account of the way victims of child rape, such as myself, are gaslit into thinking Nabokov was some sort of champion for us and our suffering. Again, I'm left feeling tainted by the revelation that I was gaslit into seeing Nabokov's work as anything other than a pedophile's wet dream, quite literally. Because for as much as Nabokov lashed out at those who acted like Lolita contains some sort of positive message condemning child predators, I do think it contained a moral lesson, intentional or subconscious. It was Nabokov telling us that child rape could be tender, kind, or even ecstasy. It is romanticization, one of the strongest forms of normalization in a society which already fails to take child rape seriously. There's no moral lesson here feels a lot like someone claiming to be a centrist to hide their true position. And I helped him do that, in my own small ways, just like everyone else who has ever forwarded this myth. But it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to have been pressured into believing a myth only to later realize the truth, so long as we do whatever we can to break said myth. I can't go back in time and tell younger me to stand firm in my repulsion, but I can share this information in hopes that it A, might spare other victims the same guilt down the line, and B, start to dismantle this myth entirely. That's why I'm here, making this video, opening myself in a rather vulnerable way, when I could have just changed tones and never explained why. I think we need more people willing to publicly own up to their mistakes, to then go on and try to fix things, not less. And I think the way we do that is by leading via example. This was a mantra that stuck with me from my secularism days, with science being a system which is constantly self-correcting, a trait which is its greatest strength. So I'm asking you to do the same, to share this video and correct people when they make this argument. Together, we can destroy this fucked up myth. Though, what do you think? What are your thoughts on this myth? Why is society so hell-bent on pushing it? Are you a survivor who was gaslit by this? And if so, how does this revelation impact you? Did you notice something I missed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help keep us running so that we can learn from our mistakes, please consider becoming one of the wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Flynn, Bo Ayer, Deborah Goldsmith, Higgins Siegel, Jackie Sins, Mix Alba, and Peter Cole. And for myself, Adita, and Levi, take care now.